Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination has spent his life writing about, examining, and actively trying to transform America's traumatized soul and dysfunctional political system. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who covered the first Gulf War and was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief in the Middle East and the Balkans for 15 years for the New York Times. He covered the Falklands War for National Public Radio and the conflicts in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala for the Christian Science Monitor and NPR. He survived ambushes in Central America, imprisonment in Sudan and Basra, a bounty on his head by Saddam Hussein, daily bombings in Sarajevo, and a beating by Saudi military police. He's seen and reported on some of the worst examples of human evil, death, torture, and brutality imaginable. Chris published a weekly column in Truthdig for 14 years and now writes a column on SharePost. He's taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton, and the University of Toronto. His numerous books include War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America, Death to the Liberal Class, and America, the Farewell Tour. His latest book, Our Class, takes us into the trauma and transformation of an American prison, the maximum security East Jersey State Prison, better known as Rahway. It's where Chris has taught courses in drama, literature, philosophy, and history since 2013, and where his first class of students, inspired by what they read and documenting their artistic and personal discoveries, wrote their own play called Caged, which was published and played to sold-out audiences in the Passage Theater in Trenton. He holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard. His father, also a preacher, validated his calling by telling him, "You're ordained to write." Chris's life and work can perhaps be best exemplified in what James Baldwin referred to as the call. It's when you try to stand up and look the world in the face like you had a right to be here that you realize you've attacked the entire power structure of the Western world. It's also expressed in the old Negro spiritual, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell an old Pharaoh to let my people go." So, Chris, welcome. Thank you so very, very much for being on Radical Imagination. It's really a pleasure and an honor, and there's so much I want to talk with you about today. And just with that introduction, our audience can tell that you have really seen it. You've seen the worst of humanity. And yet you've written this book, and it's Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. So you are talking about ways that love and transformation can occur, that the human soul can resist so much of the violence and hardship and brutality it's experienced. It's still a long shot, but it's a process of struggle, of resistance, and doing the right thing. So let's get started. Tell us how you entered into this venture. How did you start teaching in Rahway State Prison?
So I had been teaching before in the youth correctional facility in Clinton, New Jersey, known as Wagner. And this was before Rutgers had set up a degree program within the New Jersey prison system. So it had already been, I guess, about 3 years in terms of teaching. I was doing it with a friend of mine, Celia Chazelle, who's the head of the history, or was at the time the head of the history department at the College of New Jersey. We would teach semester-long courses. Of course, we were unpaid. We would buy the books ourselves, and it had no academic validity. But if they completed the coursework, we would print out certificates on our computers at home and give them to them, and they would put it in their folders, which would certainly help them when they came before parole boards. So 2013, I start in this program, a wonderful program, NJ STEP, which allows students in the New Jersey prison system to get their associates and even their BA degrees. And I was teaching drama, August Wilson, Amira Baraka, and others, The Dutchman by Leroy Jones, and then changed his name to Amira Baraka, and Miguel Pinero. And it was clear at that first class that most of my students had very little familiarity with drama. And so just on a whim, I suggested that they write scenes in dramatic dialogue every week about their lives. Well, what I didn't know at that first class was that one of the students in the class, nicknamed Kabir in Arabic is big, and this guy was big, knew who I was from listening to WBAI in New York, and had recruited the best writers in the prison. So when I went home that first night, there were 28 students with these scenes and started reading through them. There were about a half dozen that were incredibly eloquent and lyrical and powerful. And this happened over a couple of weeks. It wasn't accidental. There was clearly tremendous talent. I wasn't the only writer in that room. I showed them to my wife, Eunice Wong, a graduate of Juilliard, a professional actor. And that's where I came up with this idea, which was not meditated, of helping them write a play as we read these dramatic works. And I was working on a book at the time. I put it aside for the 4 months that I was in the prison. I added another class every week. You can add a class if students need remedial help. So I just signed the whole class up for remedial help. There was a little whinging, but they all came. And then we really set to work. And I was primarily the editor and shaped it. And what was so powerful about it is that you in prison, and I know you know because you've taught in prisons, you really, to survive, build these emotional walls.
Yes.
Protect yourself. Any kind of vulnerability easily sees you turned into prey. But by writing about these experiences, this grief, this loss, this pain, this love, all of these things that my students had undergone, these walls melted away. And you would have, it was always also interesting that they really wanted, in most cases, to read what they had written out loud. And if I couldn't get, enough people up there, they would complain. But of course, I was trying to balance the study of Joe Turner Come and Gone and Fences and these kinds of plays that we were also discussing in the classroom. But these guys, some of the scenes were just so emotional that people couldn't read them. But the stuff that came out was just incredibly powerful, and stuff that people had harbored to themselves, that they sometimes had known people in that prison for decades and never shared it with any of the other students. So it inadvertently became this kind of very therapeutic exercise where within that prison classroom, people expressed tremendous vulnerability, tremendous pain, and people would often their hands would be shaking or they would be fighting back tears. So it was really a transformative experience, both for them and for myself.
Yeah, I was going to get into the transformation for you as well as this minister. There's a passage I just like to read here early on in the book that gives an indication of the role that you saw yourself in. uh, and trying to transform people through this love, the love that informs the long struggle for justice, that directs us to stand with the crucified, the love that defines the lives and words of James Baldwin, George Orwell, James Cone, and Cornel West, is the most powerful force on earth. It does not mean we will be spared pain or suffering. It does not mean we will achieve justice. It does not mean we as distinct individuals will survive. It does mean we will. It does not mean we will escape death, but it gives us the strength to confront evil when it seems certain that evil will triumph. That love is not a means to an end. It is the end itself. That is the secret of its omnipotence. That is why it will never be conquered. I mean, that's a powerful, powerful passage. That's what I think you're partly talking about here, right? What you were able to instill in these people's souls and touching your soul to such a deep level as well. Correct?
Yeah, I don't think I instilled it. I think it was there, and I think the transformation was that it came out when
Yeah,
we mounted
that's
the
a better way
play.
to put it.
When we mounted the play in Trenton, they brought down this very talented director from Chicago, Jarrell Henderson. And I remember Jarrell reading through the play and saying, "This is really a play about radical love." And he was right. I don't think I'd articulated it until he said it, because you have, from the moment, the inception of the play, and it begins outside the prison and kind of loosely follows a real life experience of a guy who was framed for a crime that he didn't commit, and that he was the sole breadwinner, taking care of his mother, who was quite ill, had cancer, and his younger brother, who was 16, who was trying to keep in school. He goes to prison. The family disintegrates. The mother dies. All of this is based on a true story. The kid, this younger brother, his older brother had tried to keep out of the streets, starts to hustle to get money to try and hire a lawyer to get his brother out. And what from the moment that the play opens, it's clear to the characters that many of them will not survive. The play ends with this very poignant scene, again based on a real life experience, written in fact by one of my very talented students, Boris Franklin, who was the first student, fortunately, to get out. Because after we wrote the play, when I originally said, okay, who wants a part? I only had 7 people in the class who wanted parts. But as the process unfurled, all 28 students wanted parts. So we had a play with 28 roles, which is not something you can mount on a stage. So it was really, fortunately, with Boris that we worked along with Eunice and then a theater director, Jeff Wise in New York, who workshopped it and helped us. That we consolidated those characters into roughly a half dozen characters. But at the end of the play, there's this scene that's based on Boris's own experience where there's a dispute and somebody is going into the mess hall with an improvised knife called a shank. Mess halls and the yards are the most dangerous places in prison traditionally. And the character physically stops this guy from going in. This is something that Boris did. And it was interesting when it was put up on the stage at the Passage Theater in Trenton, and I watched, and Boris played that part. And the rest of them were equity actors, but in some ways they couldn't reach the depths that Boris reached in his own life, his own experience. I mean, really came through that scene, and he was pushing the character. He was very physical with the other person who was going into the mess hall, which surprised me. And I asked him after the play why, and he said, because if he didn't give me the shank, then I was going to have to start a fight, and we would both go to lockup. So if there's a constant theme in the play they wrote, it is about radical love. It is about sacrificing for the other prisoners who are doing life bids or even 2 life bids and know that they will die in prison, working to help other prisoners get out. It really captures and everything disintegrates. Even the family disintegrates by the end of the play, and they know it will disintegrate, and yet they exhibit this loyalty and this love anyway. And that's what is so not only poignant about what they wrote, but for me is what makes them such amazing people with incredible integrity and talent and You know, I think it exposes uh, their kind of inner worth, which is made all the more powerful because they've been so demonized by the wider society.
Yeah, and now they tested you out as well, right? I mean, this is an environment where trust is hard to come by, and so at first they really needed to figure out who you were and what did you stand for. Were they just, why were you there? What were you all about? Perhaps what were your motives and so on. So you experienced that as well,
Yeah,
correct?
they don't like do-gooders, which I get. These people who come in to kind of burnish their own credentials, and
Yeah,
so I mean, I would say I came into the prison with a kind of, you mentioned it in your opening, a very different background from other academics. I've been around a lot of violence, so it doesn't kind of faze me. There was actually a moment when I asked the students, if you shank someone in the prison and kill them, don't you know you're going to get another life bid, that you're never going to get out? And the class said, oh, yeah, but you have to do it anyway. That's the code of the prison. And then at the end of the class, one of the students came up and said, everything you heard in this classroom is BS, because I shanked and killed someone, actually did it in Wagner. And you don't think about anything. You're just so enraged and furious that your anger just takes over. You don't think at all. And the next class, one of the students came up and he said, well, I watched your face while this student explained that he just shanked and killed somebody in the prison, and you didn't even react. And I said, well, the world I come from, which is war, everyone in here is an amateur.
yeah, yeah.
So I think that I wasn't, I didn't find it intimidating. I didn't find them intimidating. But you're right. Of course, they're wary. They're going to feel you out, and you survive in a prison in the same way you do in a war zone. I actually have a chapter in the book called The Antenna, by reading people and reading them correctly and reading them quickly. Because if you read people wrong in a war zone, like Daniel Pearl did, it can cost you your life. And that same kind of emotional or intuitive intelligence is a prerequisite for surviving, not only on the streets of many decayed urban centers, but also in prison itself. So we had that in common.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm sure you remember, Rahway was also the facility that produced Scared Straight, wasn't it? Now,
yeah, I don't like those programs, but yeah.
No, I don't either. No, but that was no. I'm not trying to make any sort of comparison, but it was a vehicle through which, again, you could tell by the title, scaring people straight.
Right.
And thankfully, the social science research pointed out that it was actually counterproductive.
Yeah.
For all of the right reasons. More punishment, more hate just breeds more of the same. So you were dealing with people who had experienced so much shame and disrespect, and put downs. And that continued, of course, in very destructive ways in prison. The question becomes, or one of the questions becomes, how do these people possibly still retain their humanity and capture it through this creative process? And again, what sort of lesson does that tell us in terms of possible healing and transformation of the world in the face of the unspeakable evil and violence we witness every day?
Well, I'm not romantic about suffering. I've seen a lot of it, and it certainly has the capacity to destroy you. The students that I had in the class and have had in several classes that I've taught are an exceptional segment of the prison population. They're serious scholars. They've turned their cells into libraries. They have learned how to navigate a system filled with all sorts of dehumanization and trauma and abuse, and retain their dignity. That's what I find so admirable about them, that they are incredibly dignified people. And they, uh, they are willing um, to take on punishment and suffering to protect others. That also becomes a kind of recurrent theme in the play. And they're acutely aware of how the wider society has demonized them and, of course, uh, thrown them into what Michelle Alexander calls this criminal caste system, which is real. And so, in that sense, they are alienated from the wider society, but they create within the prison. And then also now I have a lot of students who are getting out, a kind of community where they rely quite heavily on each other. Prison replicates the wider society. There's a segment, actually, it's fairly small, but there is a segment of the prison population you kind of want to stay away from. There's that vast middle that zones out, anesthetizes themselves in front of ESPN or Basketball Wives or whatever the shows are, these reality television shows. And then there is this amazing group within the prison that is just intent upon self-knowledge, self-understanding. And remember, if you're making $28 a week, which is what you're paid if you work in a prison like Rahway, buying a book is a pretty massive expenditure. And so, I think there was a deep connection. I knew Susan Sontag, and I once said to her something about us being intellectuals, and she said, "No, we just love books," which is really at its core the truth. And I think that was also true for my students, is true for my students. And so there was also that intellectual connection. I mean, these are what Gramsci would call organic intellectuals.
Organic, yeah.
They never had the kind of schooling that I had. They were never given that opportunity, which is, again, is part of the great failing of our society, given how intellectually gifted they are.
Such a waste of human potential. It's unbelievable. You mentioned a segment of the prison population that one needs to stay away from, the highly violent that you're talking about. My colleague James Gilligan, psychiatrist, perhaps know some of his work. For 20 years, was the director of mental hygiene in the Department of Corrections at Massachusetts prison system. Found that there was no person that he dealt with, and some of the most violent people that this society has ever produced, was beyond redemption. And I wonder if you feel the same way. He constructed a program and found that the one variable that made all the difference in the world in terms of reducing violence in the prisons, homicide rates and suicide rates, was a 4-year college program where people could graduate and then go out, and the recidivism rate was literally zero. So we know what to do. We know how to reach people. It takes time because so many people that you find have been so damaged by that system you're talking about here, and that Michelle Alexander describes too. But I wonder again, as a minister, our leading question here, but we all have the capacity to be redeemed, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the issue, those people there are people, I've taught a few of them. I taught in Trenton, the Supermax prison, so some of these crimes are pretty awful.
Right.
There are people you want to keep at arm's length. That's a mental health issue, I think. It's and there, unfortunately, of course, because of the collapse of the mental health service, 25% of our prison population, and we should acknowledge that we have the largest prison population in the world, suffers from severe mental health issues. So if we put aside the mental health issues, yes, I would say about the college program, there are people in the prison who cannot get into the college program. Either there are developmental issues or they don't have the motivation. It's quite difficult to get in. For instance, in East Jersey State Prison, you have 140 people in the college prison program. There's about 2,000 people in the prison. We have hundreds of applications of people who can't get in. So it is a self-selected group. You're very right about recidivism rates. There's different figures. I think Massachusetts did a study of people who earn college degrees. The recidivism rate was 4% or something.
Yeah.
You have to contrast that with the recidivism rates nationally, which within 5 years are 76%. So, college program is not for everyone. And unfortunately, all programs, including vocational programs, have been lifted or abolished, along with recreational programs. I mean, prisons have just become largely warehouses, which exacerbates the trauma that people come in with, and then sees them released with compounded trauma and no skills to reintegrate within the society. So, for instance, one of my very talented students got out. He was in a robbery. He never killed anyone. And this is the other thing about the length of the sentences are insane. He and his partner had a child, and it was born premature, 23 months, I think, and so was on oxygen. He didn't have money. He didn't have health insurance, and so he started selling drugs. What would you do to pay the medical bills for his kid? And he got picked up in New York State. Now he's going back and serving a 2.5-year sentence. And I went up to Goshen, New York, where he was sentenced. And his lawyer said, well, I read his original case, and if this had happened in New York State, he would have gotten about 4 years. He got 26 years in Jersey. There's no rhyme or reason to these sentences, especially if you go to trial. We should be clear that 94% of those who are in prison never get a jury trial. The system would crash if everyone got jury trials. They're coerced into taking plea deals, and the way you coerce people into taking plea deals is that you stack charges against them, which both the police and the prosecutors know they didn't commit. Kidnapping's a favorite one because that's 25 years. So they say, well, we'll remove the kidnapping, we'll remove this, we'll remove that. They barter with them. They barter with the public defense attorneys, again, who are overworked and don't have time to focus on any of these cases. And the tragedy this is anecdotal, but in the many years I've been teaching in the prison, is that those students that I teach with the longest prison sentences are the ones who went to trial. And they usually almost always went to trial because they didn't commit the crime. And they naively believed that because they were innocent, the system would validate that innocence. And in fact, they're made an example of. Their sentences are insanely, they're de facto life sentences. I'll give you one example. A student I had, his parents had both died. He was, when he was young, his father died when he was very young. His mother died when I think he was 9 or 10. He was living in an abandoned house, Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States. He's a 14-year-old kid. He weighs 90 pounds, functionally illiterate. He's picked up by the Camden City Police, hauled into a room and forced to sign a confession for a murder and a rape he didn't commit. And he gets to trial and hears the charges that supposedly he's confessed to and attempts to protest, and he's slapped down in the court, and he's sentenced as an adult, and then not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. This is the kind of grotesque injustice that is a daily occurrence within the American prison system. And what's so amazing about Lawrence is that he just decided that he told me that he was going to die in this prison, but he was going to become the best person he could. I taught a history class. After this class, we read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins on the Haitian independence movement. I am a very hard grader, and so he was one of my very few A's in the class. He waited till everyone walked out of the room, and he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher, like you," and he walks out. We got him through a wonderful public attorney, Jennifer Saletti, resentencing hearing because of the Supreme Court ruling on Miller of sentencing juveniles as if they were adults. And he got out, he finished Rutgers, graduated summa cum laude, and is now working as a community organizer in Brooklyn. So there's one happy ending. There aren't many.
Right. Let's talk about the political cultural system that has set up this fear-based worldview and perpetuates it and continues to act it out, and the role of liberals in this, quite frankly. You talk about, you quote James Baldwin, deplored the self-love in American society, particularly in the white churches, called it the lie of their pretended humanity, or the hypocrisies of liberal elites and the left, whose moral posturing often is not accompanied by the courage and self-sacrifice demanded in the fight against radical evil. This desire to divide and conquer, to pit one against each other, how does that fit into your other writings, particularly on the liberal class, liberal elites?
Well, in my book, The Death of Liberal Class, I talk about a transformation of the liberal elite personified by Bill Clinton and Joe Biden and Barack Obama, these kind of faux liberals who speak in that kind of feel your pain language and yet carry out an assault against the vulnerable and the poor. Let's not forget that half of my students wouldn't be in prison but for Joe Biden and Bill Clinton and the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill. More than doubled our prison population, militarized the police, created the 3 strikes you're outlaws so people can go to. I've taught people, by the way, who have life without parole, never committed a violent crime or never charged with a violent crime. And this was the quote unquote liberal establishment, the super predators, to quote Hillary Clinton. And Naomi Murakawa wrote a good book, The First Civil Right, where she really talks about the rise of mass incarceration and militarized police as being the brainchild, in essence, of a Democratic Party leadership under Clinton that decided quite consciously that they would take back, in their words, the law and order issue from the Republican Party. I mean, Biden, for instance, increased exponentially the number of federal crimes that warrant the death penalty and used to brag about it on the campaign trail. So yeah, the liberal elites are, as you know, have been full partners in the rise of the carceral state. But let's be clear that there is a logic to the rise of the carceral state from their viewpoint, as well as a logic to the militarized police that create reigns of terror in marginal communities. Because if you deindustrialize the country, again, especially under NAFTA, courtesy of a Democratic administration, if you leave these urban wastelands bereft of any ability, and then, of course, Clinton again cutting welfare, destroying the welfare system, you force people into the illegal economy in order to survive. And then what are your forms of social control? You've ruptured the social bonds that knit people to a society: work, home, place, a sense of dignity, a sense of worth. All of that is taken away, and your social bonds become very draconian, and they are embodied in militarized police and the carceral state. So we talk about prison reform. Well, there won't be any prison reform until we restructure the society and begin to invest in people rather than in institutions of control. And the Democrats are as culpable in this as the Republicans.
Yeah. The irony of calling these institutions maximum security. I mean, there is no security really there. And look what's happening in New York. You have a new mayor now who is going back to some of the tried and untrue practices. You have a police chief who's following those orders as well. And these are African-American woman. What might you say about that?
It was interesting. When we wrote the play, there was a corrections officer in the play. And the entire class, almost all of whom are black, said, "Don't make him white." They said that's the easy way. In fact, there's no shortage of people who, for a money and a stable job, will do the dirty work of on behalf of white supremacy. And this is the whole debate about, are we going to have a black woman on the Supreme Court? This is
Right.
utterly ridiculous. I mean, is Clarence Thomas an asset because he's black? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, of course. But that gets into the whole identity politics. But it was really interesting to me that they did not want that corrections officer to be white. They wanted him to be black. And so, yes, the in an age of tokenism, you're not talking about putting a labor lawyer or a human rights ACLU attorney on the Supreme Court. We're talking about putting somebody's skin color and gender. This is just a species of corporate colonialism. I mean, you can look at the independence movement in the Congo. You have the wonderful, amazing resistance leader Patrice Lumumba, who's assassinated by the CIA and French intelligence, so that they can put Mobutu in charge, who's also black, but will dance to the tune of his white masters. That, by the way, was the theme of August Wilson's last play, Radio Gulf. It was about a slick, black, charismatic, well-educated politician, read Barack Obama, who does the dirty work of the wealthy white real estate developers in Pittsburgh.
And again, the liberals and others, of course, but miss the whole idea of discussing the class struggle and class consciousness. Marx predicts the capitalist system will begin to consume the structures that sustained it. I think you have touched on that. That's happening all around us, all over the country. So the liberals never really do talk about the underlying structure, the structural violence that produces 250,000 deaths and tens of millions around the world. So the cynicism, the hypocrisies that you've so documented, what are we left with? Are we left with, as you said before, this idea of revolutionary love to maintain a sense of integrity? I was so moved by your address to your students upon their graduation. I just want to mention a little of that, in which you say, "My fellow college graduates, integrity is not an inherited trait. It is not conferred by privilege or status or wealth. It cannot be bequeathed by elite schools or institutions. It's not a product of birth or race or gender. Integrity is not a pedigree or a brand. Integrity is earned. Integrity is determined not by what you do in life, but what you do with what life gives us. It is what we overcome. Integrity is the ability to affirm our dignity, even when the world tells us we are worthless. Integrity is forged in pain and suffering, loss and tragedy."
Well, these are some of the most remarkable men, and I've taught in the women's prison, that I've ever met in my life. And I, in that address, make it very clear that in the end, and I think a lot of us who teach in the prison feel the same way, that it's an honor for us
Absolutely.
to be there, to be allowed into their lives, because especially as a white male, they, because of the evil of white supremacy, they and their families and everyone they care about has suffered tremendously from white privilege. This is, part of the tragedy of the prison system. It's so massive. We drive by these institutions, but very few people stop to ask what's happening inside, the dehumanization and the. I just can't vote for a figure like Joe Biden. I can't forgive him for destroying, through the omnibus crime bill, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives, of families. When you lock up people in prison, it's not just the person that is being incarcerated who suffers. It's their children, it's their families, And ultimately it's their community, and it's us, because we are depriving ourselves of people with such talents and such brilliance and ultimately such integrity. And that is the tragedy of the carceral state, um, which has become cemented into the American system with sentences that are disproportionate given the rest of the world. I always tell my students, uh, guess how many years Gabriel Princip received for assassinating the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie. 20 years. I got 20 years, guys serving 20 years who never committed a violent crime.
Right, right. I'm going to ask you something. You're not going to remember this probably, but I met you at an event. This was about 10, 11, 12 years ago or so. Probably left Forum or someplace, and you were finished your talk and been out the door. But I was involved in stop and frisk, the demonstrations, and the trial at that point. And I asked you if you had a chance to talk to the police commissioner. What would you say, Tim? What would be one thing that you would want to say? One question, and you could say that as well if you had Biden or Obama in front of you. What would you say to them? I don't know if you remember what you told me, but that's unfair. But I mean,
I don't remember. What did I say?
Well, it was very astute. You said, Bratton, how would you like it if your kids were every day of the week being hauled off and thrown up against the wall by your own police? How does it? I thought it was very, very astute. I remember that, obviously, over the years. I think it rings true, but yet I'm not so sure that even if you're able to have those few minutes with these people, I mean, what do you think? What do you think they would say to you? Would they say, well, maybe it's okay, he needs to be on guard? Or, how would you respond to that?
It's like talking into a black hole. They don't hear it. They don't want to hear it. Yeah. They create their own reality. That allows them to do what they do. That allows them to carry out the repression or oppression that the institutions of oppression that they run. You're not going to penetrate that self-delusion by asking them a question. Or it goes back to Lear. I once taught Lear, by the way, over a summer in the Supermax prison in Trenton, and it was interesting. I mean, Trenton is really hell on earth, like all these Supermax prisons where you can be locked in for days on end. You're lucky to get out for an hour. There are no programs, no rec time. They won't put the college degree program in the prison because, in the words of an administrator, it's a waste of time because they're all going to die in here anyway. Yeah. But in the course of that play, is a bit of a digression, but in the course of the play, we were talking about the attempted suicide by Gloucester, and it turns out a third of my classroom had either seriously contemplated or attempted suicide in the prison. But it gets down to that moment where Lear is stripped, the king is stripped of all of his power, all of his worldly goods. He's out on the heath in the rain with a beggar that he finally understands. So I don't think that these people ensconced in that kind of power, they have built around them a kind of protective wall, both physical and emotional, that blinds them. Remember, privilege, I tell this to my students all the time, privilege, especially white privilege, is a form of blindness. I learned that as a foreign correspondent. So even though I speak Arabic and spent months of my life in Gaza, I could never fully understand what it was to be a Palestinian living in the world's largest open-air prison. And if I honor that blindness, I work as hard as I can to see. That's also true with my students, just little things. When I go into Trenton, I was telling Boris once that, because there's a lot of hostility often from the corrections officers. And I said, if I go in there and there's a white officer, I always get a little more nervous because there will be more harassment and more kind of caustic asides than a black officer. And I said, well, maybe because the black officers have a little more empathy. He said, no,
No,
It's because the black officers don't know what your relationship is to the man. And
yeah,
so they can't play you like the white. And there's a little moment where, of blindness. So I think if we honor that blindness, which I do, then you can have real relationships with those who are oppressed. And that is really the message of Lear, that you really ultimately have to be reduced to that position within society with these oppressive forces against you to fully understand. Otherwise, you
what
can't.
you're doing. Great point. By the way, I sent you a couple hours ago the email for the James Gilligan book launch on his new book on Shakespeare, Shame and Guilt and Violence. So NYU on the 22nd. I think you'd probably find it very interesting. You touched on Gaza, and again, well, I've had a number of spiritual progressives, and Susanna Heschel, and so on the show, and Reverend Barber, of course, Cornell. It pains me so much to know here are people from that prophetic tradition. Love the other, love the stranger. How do you reach the Israelis? And what is the role of their own traumatization in history and the subsequent destruction they're bringing, as you say, into Gaza and to the Palestinians? What is the way out of this as we try to understand our respective traumas?
Well, it's Auden. I in the good book know what all school children learn: those to whom evil is done do evil in return. The only way out is the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which I am a strong supporter of, as is Cornell. And that was probably the primary reason he did not get tenure at Harvard, led by this monstrosity, Larry Summers.
Yeah.
So we have to pit power against power. That's Frederick Douglass. That's the only way to do it. And just as the sanctions ultimately worked against the apartheid regime in South Africa, we have to build the same kind of sanctions against the apartheid regime of Israel.
Do in just a couple minutes we have left, when Noam Chomsky was on, he mentioned the work of Ahad Haman. I don't know if you are familiar with his work, that Israel should be a spiritual home for the values and ethics of Judaism, a spiritual basis for Zionism. I wonder if that appeals to you as well.
Well, you can't. How can you have those values and ethics if you're occupying another people?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Israel, from its inception, was a colonial settler project. I mean, just as we were. I mean, that was always the intent. They stole the land and displaced the people and committed ethnic cleansing and large-scale massacres. We can debate whether that's genocide or not, but certainly a lot of Palestinians were killed in 1948. So, I love Noam. I admire Noam. He's our greatest intellectual, and I did an event a couple of years ago with him in San Francisco, and we got onto BDS. Noam does not support BDS. I did not want to argue with Noam Chomsky, but when we were up together on the stage, he said, "I don't know how you can call it a movement." That's not really, for me, a cogent argument against BDS, whether it's a movement or not. I don't. That's not a reason not to support it. It's, first of all, I don't like violence. I've been around a lot of it, and this is a non-violent movement that begins to put pressure on Israel on behalf of the Palestinians, and it's the only weapon that we have. And I think the fact that Israel has invested so much in attacking the movement, including passing a rash of laws in state legislatures that make it a crime on American soil to boycott Israel. I mean, this is just insane. I mean, but it shows you how frightened they are. And it's not that the BDS movement has had much success. It hasn't in terms of getting anyone to divest or anything like that. But where it has been successful is raising the consciousness, especially on college campuses. So Students for Justice in Palestine is also an organization that's routinely targeted by the Zionist lobby in an attempt to close it down. So I don't have much time for Jewish liberals who don't support BDS. They kind of mirror American liberals who want to posit themselves as moral arbiters of the society, but will not engage in the kinds of or support the kinds of mechanisms that can bring justice to the society. So it becomes a lot about their own self-adulation, really,
Yeah.
rather than effectiveness. So look, to openly support BDS as Cornel West illustrated at Harvard, there's a cost to it. But look, it's that old adage: if you truly stand with the oppressed, in the end, you're going to be treated like the oppressed.
We're gonna have to leave it at. We're gonna have to leave it at that.
Cornell does.
Thank you, Chris. We're gonna have to leave it at that. It's been wonderful to have you on. This is the book, Our Class, and couldn't put it down. It's really terrific. I hope our audience, everybody in the audience, gets it, and continue. Good luck and good health, and all the best in life. Chris, thank you so very, very much for being on the show.
Thanks for doing it.
Okay. And thank you all for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. We hope you enjoyed the show with Chris Hedges. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.